Wave if you can hear me. Great. Well, I'm very glad to be with you all today, if only virtually. As Marcus said, this is actually my second EBRD virtual event. I was also a member of the Book Prize, and I was hoping to enjoy an event at EBRD earlier in the year. But I'm very glad to be with you. Thanks to the BEARR Trust. Many thanks to Nicola and Janet for inviting me. And thank you to Marcus, my old colleague from Moscow, and indeed actually even from doing Russian at Oxford as well. So I'm going to talk a bit today about these countries in between, the 6 Eastern Partnership countries. I come from the perspective of someone who, like a lot of people who work in this region, who started off as a Russianist by learning Russian and indeed worked in Russia in the 1990s. But then I sort of moved outwards to what the Russians would regard as the periphery, but I don't want to think of it as a periphery. In particular, the countries of the South Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and latterly also in the last few years, Ukraine and Moldova as well. So I want to talk a bit about those countries which are often forgotten or squeezed or told as part of someone else's story, and sort of ask the question, because we are in this BEARR Trust setting, about what's gone wrong there, what more can be done for them, and also a bit what's gone right there. So we're talking about the 6 countries, which 3 in Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus, and then we're also talking about the 3 countries of the South Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. A kind of strange sextet, if you will. So we're talking about these 6 countries, which the EU has designated as the Eastern Partnership. Originally, I think the intention was to focus for the EU, particularly just on the Western countries, Ukraine, Belarus, and Moldova. But after the 2008 Georgia war, Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think, swung into focus for the EU and joined the Eastern Partnership project, which was launched in 2009. And we immediately get into an interesting conceptualization issue here. And I'm going to talk quite a lot about Russia, obviously, and I'm going to try and be subtle. So hopefully my subtlety will come across, that I have a slightly different take on the Russia issue in my presentation. I do believe that Russia has a very negative influence and rather negative ambitions for this area. And so there is a natural focus on Russia, but I also believe that Russia's capacities are greatly overrated when we're talking about this region. So when we're talking about the conceptualization of this region, often we fall into the trap, I think, of seeing this region through its neighbours. So often, for example, even I was very frustrated, for example, reading stories back in 2018 about the Armenian revolution, to describe it as Russia's backyard. Well, if you look at the map, you can see that Russia is actually a long way from Armenia. It doesn't even share a common border. This is the sort of mindset where the post-Soviet space is still seen through a Russian lens. And indeed, I think we should begin to question the term post-Soviet altogether. Again, in Armenia in 2018, I saw some people saying, well, we can't call it post-Soviet, do we call it post-Soviet or non-Soviet? And I think, soon, hopefully, we can retire all those terms altogether. Again, there's attempts to talk about Eurasia, which sounds a bit reminiscent of George Orwell's 1984. I think that fits better with Russia and Central Asia, and to some extent the Caucasus, but doesn't really work when we're talking about Ukraine or Moldova. And of course, the Russians have their own terminology. They talk about the near abroad, which implies that it's abroad, but only sort of abroad. And they still talk about the trans-Caucasus, which is their term for what we more neutrally call the South Caucasus. So I think the point here is that we're talking about a region which is actually multiple neighborhoods at once. It is, of course, Russia's neighborhood, but it's also the neighborhood of the European Union, and the neighborhood, indeed, of other powers as well, in the Caucasus, obviously, of Turkey and of Iran. And no neighbor has exclusive influence over this region. But obviously Europe tries to do something different because of Europe's famed soft power, and hopefully that includes the United Kingdom post-Brexit as well. But what we see is a classic a classic case of hedging, of strategic hedging, in which the countries of this region they want multiple relationships at once. Obviously, Russia is a difficult neighbor, but also an important one, where which is important. Large members of the diaspora live there for economic reasons, for strategic reasons, and Georgia is, and the European Union is as well. So, for example, in Georgia in 2016, there was a poll conducted. There were 4 options. Do they think that Georgia should be pro-Western, which comes out at 14%, pro-Western but good relations with Russia comes out at 52%, pro-Russia but good relations with EU, NATO comes out at 16%, and pro-Russian, merely pro-Russian at 5%. So I think that poll from supposedly and probably the most pro-Western country of the 6, I think is indicative of the fact that even in Georgia, people want a Western perspective, but they want to maintain good relations with Russia for some very pragmatic reasons. And that kind of strategic thinking amongst the populace is something we should be factoring in when we're forging relations with these countries. Let me go back to the 1990s when Marcus and I were both correspondents in Moscow. And recall that was a time when actually Russia was democratic, more or less, and there were perhaps more hopes invested in Russia than in these other countries. And these countries all fell behind in the 1990s, without exception, due to conflict and due to many reasons. And if you consider that that they all started on the same level with the Baltic states, I think we can measure the scale of the disappointment of those years, and particularly the 1990s. A lot of comparative statistics around. I looked at the World Bank website and I was looking for one which would indicate how far these countries have fallen behind the Baltic states, having started at the same level in 1991. And I found one which was very indicative, which was health expenditure per capita in 2019. In Ukraine, per capita, health expenditure, this is in dollars, was just $177 per person in 2019. In Azerbaijan, it was 275. In Belarus, which was the largest of the 6, it was 342. Now that compares to Estonia, where it was $1,300 per capita, more than 10 times than Ukraine. And I think if we want to look at failures, I think that's a good place to start. Is in the health system of these countries. If you haven't read Oliver Bullow's great book Moneyland, there's an absolutely devastating section there about the Ukrainian health system and its how it was the victim of corruption, how indeed there was actually an outbreak of polio in Ukraine in 2015, even though polio had supposedly been eradicated from Ukraine. Now, that great falling behind, where do we attribute the blame there? Well, of course, Russian meddling to some extent, but this was the 1990s when Russia was also preoccupied very much with its own affairs. But I think a common theme in all these countries in the 1990s was that there was what you might call a nationalist nomenclatura that took over. They were nationalist in image, but in substance, they were actually still the old Communist Party nomenclatura, who had just wrapped themselves up in a new flag and were using independence, rather cynically, often using the symbols of nationhood to pursue an agenda in which a lot of the privatization and the seizure of assets was done by members of the elite. And of course that happened all across the board, apart from in the Baltic states. It also happened in Russia. But I think it was particularly egregious in the countries that we're talking about, especially, I would say, in Ukraine and the Caucasus. Where did all that wealth go? Well, this again is a whole topic in itself. But sitting in London, we could see that unfortunately, a lot of it is around us. A lot of the wealth of those countries from that period was looted and taken offshore, and unfortunately, our own society, our own legal system colluded in making that possible. I'm sure you all know about some of the more lurid examples of that. For example, that the most expensive apartments in London were bought in a address called 1 Hyde Park in 2010 by the richest man of Ukraine, Rinat Akhmetov, who paid £136 million for just those 2 apartments. So we also have our collusive role, unfortunately, in the failure of these countries in the post-Soviet period. I would say various Azerbaijanis, including some members of the ruling family, have tried to catch up with that, but I think no one else, has spent that single amount of money on a single set of apartments. Coming back to Russia, I think we see, obviously we see a very menacing Russian profile at the moment under Putin. Even in the last 6 months, a subject I'd like to return to, which is Putin's use of history, we've seen a very menacing language. But I also see continuities in Russia's attitude to this region, seeing it as a region of privileged interest way back in the 1990s. Their language may have been a little more moderate, but if you read speeches from Boris Yeltsin or Andrei Kozyrev back in the 1990s, they were very clear that they regarded the near abroad as their sphere of influence, that Russian troops had to stay, that they wanted Russian pipelines to go through the region. And if you all remember the Commonwealth of Independent States, an organization that still exists, but which is rather in abeyance. This, I think, illustrates my point about Russia being first amongst equals. Everyone is standing round. The nationalist nomenclatura well represented here in people like Nazarbayev and Kravchuk from Kazakhstan, Ukraine. But the man in the middle, the man who takes center stage, the man who's putting his thumbs up is Boris Yeltsin. And he sees this very much as his club in which he's the first amongst equals. So that attitude was already there in the 1990s. But my main point about the Russian role here is that I think there's a huge gap, and I don't think this is properly appreciated, between Russian ambitions for this region and Russian capacities. And I think that's still true to this day, that in Russian attitudes towards this region, often their influence is more in the imagination of Russians than in the actual reality of the capacity that they project on the ground. And we can see that, and obviously, I do not want to minimize the very destructive influence of Russia on many regions, particularly the conflict regions. If you're a Ukrainian from Donetsk, or a Crimean Tatar, or Georgian from South Ossetia, then indeed the influence of Russia is very real. It's not in the imagination, it's in your everyday life. But overall, I think we do see a massive decline in Russian influence in the last 25 years. We see it in a military retreat from the region, the fact that there were Russian bases in Georgia and Azerbaijan, in Ukraine in the 1990s, all of which have gone. And in the South Caucasus, if we exclude Abkhazia and South Ossetia, which are rather special cases, there's just one Russian base now in Armenia. We see it in the trade diversification of these countries. We see it the fact that if you look at their trade statistics, every time you see a kind of top 4, which is Russia, China, the EU, and Turkey, in different orders, but really often, around 20% of the trade in each case, and in the Western countries, the EU share being considerably bigger. So massive trade diversification. You see it even in the fact of remittances, about where people, workers are working abroad. Last year, there was an extraordinary moment when I read a report from Moldova saying that more Moldovans in Israel were actually sending home more money to Moldova than Moldovans in Russia. We see it in energy dependence going down in the South Caucasus in terms of pipelines, the fact that Georgia and Azerbaijan are now linked by oil and gas pipelines which don't go to Russia, and how Ukraine and Moldova are still very reliant on Gazprom, but also using links to the European Union. We see a decline in Russian language, which I don't necessarily think is altogether a good thing. As a Russian linguist, I don't. The Russian language is not necessarily a correlation of loyalty to Russia. Certainly in the case of Ukraine, we see a lot of very patriotic Ukrainians who oppose Russian power but speak Russian. But this is just a fact. Again, polls from Georgia suggest that about half only of 18 to 35-year-old Georgians speak good Russian, whereas it was 80 or 90% 15 or 20 years ago. And we see it in declining Russian TV coverage, which I would argue is a good thing. Interestingly, having looked at this again, the country which seems to have the highest Russian TV watching is, well, if this was a hall, I could ask you to shout out the answer, but I can't do that. The answer is actually Moldova, where about 80% of Moldovans are watching either Russian TV channels or rescreening of Russian TV channels. We see it at the elite level as well, that there are no longer the personal connections there. If you look at the leaders across the region, I'd say only one of them, Ilham Aliyev from Azerbaijan, spent his youth and studied in Moscow and still has those elite level connections. All the other leaders studied either at home or sometimes in Europe. So again, all this is to say that Russia is no longer a metropolis. This is a slide to illustrate that point. Armenia is a member of the Eurasian Union, a close Russian military ally. Russia owns many of the key assets there. And in analytical terms, one thinks of Armenia as being a kind of close Russian client. But when you actually go to Armenia, you realize that it's a very different reality there, that Moscow and Russia are no longer the metropolis. And indeed, we saw Russia not intervening in 2018 when a more pro-Russian figure, Serge Sarkisyan, was peacefully overthrown and Nikol Pashinyan took over in a peaceful revolution. And this is a snapshot of that revolution. The slogans are in Armenian. They're saying a peaceful revolution because they're cancelling out the gun there. There is a Russian figure here, but he's the cuddly Russian bear called Cheburashka from a Russian cartoon series. And I'm afraid an Armenian did tell me what that means, but I've forgotten. But that's the only Russian thing in that picture, is that little cartoon figure. Otherwise, this is very much a non-Soviet, non-Russian youth taking power, a new generation in Armenia taking over. So, and then if we turn to Russia itself, I think, again, if you look at the Levada opinion polls, you see that despite some very aggressive comments often by the leadership, Russian public opinion is also not in a very aggressive mood towards its neighbours. There was high approval for the takeover of Crimea, the annexation of Crimea in 2014, but which, has huge implications for Ukraine and Crimea. But I think that was very much a special case as far as Russia is concerned. I don't think the Russian public has its eye on any other territories in the neighborhood. Again, I was looking at the Levada polling as I was writing this, and I see that Russians in that polling overwhelmingly now associate there being a great power, which they certainly want to be, with a strong economy. A 2019 question to the Russian public found that 82% of Russians said that the government should prioritize domestic economy over foreign influence. Only 17% of Russians approved a greater military spending, which is a very small number. So I think increasingly we should ask whether the Russian public wants the symbolism of being a great power. They want respect, but I see no appetite in opinion polling for new military adventures in the neighborhood. There's certainly historical battles being fought over the battlefield of history, but let's not project that necessarily into the idea that Russia is poised militarily to attack its neighbors. Sometimes I see, maybe I'm pushing the point a bit, but sometimes I see a little bit of collusion here, that the Russians want to exaggerate their influence in the near abroad, and some people in these countries want to avoid taking responsibility for their own problems and therefore are inclined to blame some of their problems on Russia. So there's a kind of neat coincidence of interests there, which when you look at the picture a bit more closely, you see that the Russian influence is smaller than you might imagine. Which brings me to the other powerful neighbor, which is the EU, a very different powerful neighbor, and the Eastern Partnership project. A project which, for some justifiable reasons, inspires cynicism. Some witty person pointed out that if you take the acronym of Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, you end up in Russia with the word bumaga, meaning paper, that it's just a paper partnership, that it doesn't mean anything. And certainly the Eastern Partnership was launched rather explicitly as a consolation prize to these countries for not being offered a membership perspective of the EU. What it offers is rather dull. I think it was Edward Lucas who said that the European Union offers you a kind of sandwich lunch, a reliable sandwich lunch, whereas Russia offers you occasional caviar and champagne. And it's a dull project which involves massive amounts of legislative change, of enacting socio-economic programs, and people legitimately ask, why should these 6 diverse countries be grouped together? Well, I think the answer to that is that it has actually focused minds within the EU, if only in a bureaucratic way, on this region that these countries singly would not have exercised. There was a recent online summit just a couple of weeks ago of the Eastern Partnership countries, which brought in participation by people like Angela Merkel and I believe Francois Macron. And it's hard to imagine that any of those countries singly, even Ukraine, could have commanded that kind of engagement by top-level leaders if they weren't acting as a sextet. It creates competition between the countries. It builds links between the countries, particularly through the Civil Society Forum. It's also a framework in which our EBRD friends can confirm, which enables institutions, financial institutions like the EBRD or the European Investment Bank, to make funding decisions in these countries. And in the 3 kind of leading members of the 6, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, they now have a trading relationship with the EU, which is possibly actually going to be deeper than the one the UK has in 2021. So watch that space. But I think for Ukraine in particular, and its massive efforts to reform, rather mixed efforts, but certainly very, very titanic efforts since 2014, the Eastern Partnership has been extremely important. So let me just close by a few kind of thoughts in this context, as we're in the kind of BEARR Trust context. Do I have a critique of the Eastern Partnership? What could be done better? Well, as you've noted, I think perhaps often, for some understandable reasons, we're allowing the Russia agenda a bit too much to crowd our focus on domestic issues in these countries. These countries do need reassurance against Russia. They do need hard security, but they're not going to. Ultimately, the hard work has to be done by themselves, by the government and societies in these countries, and so we need to get the balance right between dealing with them as Russia's neighbours and dealing with them as countries in themselves. And I completely understand that the EU is primarily an economic and trade actor, and that the EU's primary agenda in these countries is going to be economic. I do accept that, but I do believe that agenda is not being sufficiently supplemented by enough imagination in some other areas. And let me add in parenthesis that although I'm someone who definitely thinks that Brexit is a historical mistake, possibly there are opportunities for the UK in this context, in the sense that in our policies towards these countries, we won't be constrained anymore by EU consensus politics or the agendas or lack of agendas of other EU countries towards this region. So 4 final thoughts about how to treat this Eastern Partnership with a bit more imagination. One, I think more focus on the conflicts. This is something I write about a lot. The EU, I think, has downgraded its conflict mediation capacity in this region, and something which is a particular interest of mine. I think that there are ways of engaging more creatively in particular with Abkhazia and Transnistria, without recognizing them, but exporting EU soft power to those regions in the name of conflict resolution. The second issue, and this is going to be my final slide if it's going to work, I'm glad that Nicola mentioned the issue of rural development, because this is something which exercises me very much. This is a picture from the New York Times from a year ago. There was a rather poignant and article which I advise you to seek out from July last year about a village in Moldova which is now only has 1 resident left. He's called Grisha Muntean, and the village is called Dobrusha. And the village used to have 200 people. And I often worry that there's too much focus on urban elites in our engagement with these countries, and that while the EU and Europe is often giving with one hand to the urban elites, it's also taking away and acting as a facilitator of the depopulation of these countries, and particularly of the rural population, who in their millions have streamed westward to find jobs. Particularly Moldova, I think, is the most extreme example where perhaps a quarter to a third of the population has left, and this man is the only resident left in his village. I don't have an answer to that question, but I think rural development is absolutely an absolute requirement if these countries are not going to lose a key demographic, which is people aged between 20 and 60 who are all streaming outwards. So that's a very important issue. The third issue, which I'm again very passionate about, and I think the EU again underperforms on, is education. There isn't really enough, in my view, of an education component in the Eastern Partnership. Spending on education is historically quite low in these countries. They have underfunded education systems. Higher education is often quite well served with exchange schemes and so on, but obviously you're not going to get good higher education standards if you're not invested in early years education as well. So that's something I would again would mention. And finally, I just want to mention the issue of history, which is very relevant at the moment, obviously in our own society across the world. In Russia, where Putin has nominated himself to be Russia's national historian, and seems to be sitting at his dacha penning long essays about the Second World War and so on. This, I think, is a very negative phenomenon, but the response to it should not, I hope, for these countries, Ukraine, Moldova, etc., Georgia, to hide away and write their own nationalist histories in response, which kind of exclude Russia's role in their history or make it exclusively negative, which downplay their own difficult actions and periods in history, whether in the Second World War in Ukraine or in Georgia towards its own minorities at various points in the 20th century. Obviously, a good history involves some very many dark pages about Russia's role and about the Soviet period, but also about things that happened in these societies. I'm glad to say that this has been a focus in Moldova in recent years. I'm glad to say that Moldova has now marking World Holocaust Day and has made some big improvements in the way it remembers what happened in Moldova during the Holocaust, something which was completely forgotten for many years. But I hope other countries will as well. So I think if anything we can do in the rest of Europe to facilitate a more sophisticated dialogue on history, I think would be very helpful. I see I've run over time a bit. I've tried to raise a lot of issues. Maybe I've tried to raise too many issues, but I'll stop here, and there should be plenty of time for some questions and debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. That was a masterful overview of a subject that I imagine many people in the audience knew something about, but they now know a hell of a lot more about it and have had lots of stimulating food for thought that they can digest in the next few minutes. Now, the questions are pouring in already. Don't hold back, carry on sending them in, but I'm going to pull rank as the moderator and I'm going to ask the first question. Tom, the Eastern Partnership celebrated its 10th birthday last year. How do you think the boy or girl has done over that first 10 years, and how do you see the teenage years panning out in the years ahead?
Well, the funny thing about the Eastern Partnership, it isn't really a boy or a girl; it's a relationship, isn't it? It's a marriage or possibly not a marriage. It's possibly even a business relationship as well. So, I think it's done moderately well. I think at some point there was a realization in Brussels that there needs to be a diversification in attitudes to these countries, and they came up with a sensible more for more principle, that the certain countries would get more of the Eastern Partnership if they showed more willingness, if they did more. And this has resulted in I think, a kind of group of three, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, which are kind of the most pro-European, who have got quite a lot out of this relationship. They've got visa facilitation, which means that those people from those countries can basically travel to the EU for 90 days visa-free. They've got this trade relationship, which is longer term, but hopefully will deliver results. and they've got quite a lot of EU investment on the ground. So I think that's a pretty good scorecard. Armenia obviously only had its big breakthrough in 2018 and has been desperately acting to catch up. And then you've got the kind of two who are less interested in the EU or interested in it more in strategic terms, which are Belarus and Azerbaijan. Belarus, again, this classic issue of strategic hedging, that they want to kind of maintain their own independence while sort of giving a bit here to Russia and a bit here to the EU. At the moment, they seem to be doing rather bad and seem to be losing both. Or Lukashenko seems to be losing both, but that's a whole other issue. And Azerbaijan, which has this kind of rather proud, besieged fortress mentality, where they want to cooperate with the EU, basically on energy issues, but on very little else. And so I think the EU is saying, if you want more from us, we're there, but we'll focus on Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova. And I think that's quite sensible. So within the very real constraints that no membership perspective is on offer, I think the relationship has done fairly well. I wouldn't give it a huge plaudit, but I think it's done fairly well.
On the subject of the relationship, Janet Gunn, who's a BEARR trustee, has asked, you stress the diversity of this group of countries. Does this dilute, or maybe hamper, the EU's efforts via the Eastern Partnership to promote their development?
Well, I think we sort of just touched on that, really. I think clearly, if there was to be a one-size-fits-all policy towards all 6 countries, that it would indeed dilute. But I do think, it's a strange thing to say, but there's a kind of bureaucratic logic, which is a terrible phrase to use, but a bureaucratic logic to grouping them all together, which does give them, as a group, added prominence. And then individual agendas can be pursued within the 6 countries.
So a question from Laurie Bristow, former British ambassador in Moscow, as far as I recall. How do you see,
as well.
How do you see the long drawn out leadership succession in Russia affecting the views of the 6 Eastern Partnership members of Russia?
That's a great question. Maybe can we invite Laurie to ask it in person? Because I'd actually like to know
Good idea.
To know his opinion on that one as well. But I mean, clearly, just to say a few words, we're seeing kind of perpetual Putin in prospect now. A lot of P's there. Post-pandemic, perpetual Putin in prospect. And I think that sends a clear signal to these countries that basic core details of policy with Russia are not going to change, and that if that they can have a defensive posture towards Russia, they can certainly have a certain relationship with Russia, but they're not going to expect a benign relationship with Russia, basically as long as Putin is there and holds the views that he does. So I think that does send a clear signal, which I think the EU is well placed to take care of. Having said that, of course, the EU is very much turned inward at the moment, and we have obviously the questions about to what extent the EU has the capacity in the post-COVID landscape to do more than it does at the moment. But maybe Laurie I'd be interested in what you think.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I love the alliteration. Sort of perpetual post-Putin something. I've forgotten the rest of it. But actually, I think your last point was the nub of this. It's who do you hedge towards if you are one of the countries looking at a world of uncertainty and risk. I mean, looked at it from the Russia perspective, and my take on this is that whatever the the ups and downs and the reasons for them in Russia's external policy of the last decade or so, what just happened is not actually about perpetual Putin. It's about trying to keep control of the levers of the succession and the timing of the succession, which is not the same thing at all. And I just wonder what conclusions, well, frankly, anybody, but certainly the neighbours would make of the anxieties and the unresolved questions. So sort of put my cards on the table. I think there's really only one question now in Russian politics, and it's the timing and the manner of the transition from Putin to successor. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Laurie. I mean, my colleagues in Carnegie Moscow Center, and if you don't read carnegie.ru and you're interested in Russia, you should be, because they're writing with great subtlety about this issue. And the consensus amongst them, I don't think they necessarily agree completely, is that there seems to be a kind of, the plebiscite that we just saw was in a sense Putin sending a message to the elites that you wanted to start the transition process away from me, and I've just gone to the public, and in this rather, even if in this rather ludicrous manner, got a vote of approval from the people, and they want me to stay. I think so. That's the interpretation of Tatiana Stanovaya. I think that does mean that a lot of energy is going to be focused inward in Russia on that question, which and I think Putin has given his answer. Now, maybe you think, Laurie, that the elite has a bit more fight in it than some of my Moscow colleagues do, and maybe there will be a transition earlier than we think. But Putin seems to have hesitated and decided that he does want to stay.
Do you want to come back on that, Laurie, or are we done on perpetual Putin?
Sorry, I know others want to come in. Just very, very briefly to say, I personally do not believe that or that Mr. Putin has decided he's going to stay until 2036. I think what he's decided is that he is going to choose the timing and the manner of his departure, and that's very much an intra-elite discussion.
Okay, fair enough.
Let's move on from perpetual Putin Russia for a moment. There's still a chance for everyone to ask more questions, and we can return to Russia if you see fit. Let's move to another powerful neighbor, Turkey. Tony Wilson-Home asks, Tom, I read your book about the 1915 genocide in Anatolia, chiefly. How do you assess current Turkish-Armenian relations and the future?
This not with great optimism, unfortunately. This is a topic, an issue that I invested a lot of time in 5 or 6 years ago, in particular, when I was in Washington. And there seemed to be some more prospects of kind of Armenian-Turkish normalization. And I was a member of some very interesting dialogue projects on that subject. Marcus rather cryptically mentioned that I was supporting an opera. Well, that opera was, if you look in The Economist, was in solidarity, a little mini opera in solidarity with a wonderful figure in the arts and philanthropy in Turkey who's in jail, Osman Kavala, who I got to know on those Armenian-Turkish issues. Unfortunately, I see no prospect at the moment as long as President Erdogan is in power. He's a very different president from Prime Minister Erdogan, who seemed to encourage a kind of liberalization on that issue. He now seems to have swung over to a much more nationalist position. And while Erdogan prioritizes the relationship with Azerbaijan and is making some rather intolerant moves towards Armenia, the Armenians are certainly not going to react positively, and I'm afraid, so I don't see any prospect, as long as Erdogan is in power, of any improvement in Armenian-Turkish relations.
Another familiar name to you and me, Tom, Mary Dejevsky. Hi, Mary. She's asked, would you expand upon your point about too much emphasis on the urban elite from the West, I think that it is. Are we saying, is the West too invested in the urban elite in Ukraine? I think I'm slightly paraphrasing the question.
Yeah, well,
I distorted it.
Possibly I'm being unfair here, because I know that organizations like the EBRD certainly do work all across countries like Ukraine and do invest across the country, and including in the deprived rural communities. But I do wonder sometimes that in some of these European projects that the EU invites or chooses people who are European friendly, and it's a bit of a self-selecting process that they invite the English-speaking young pro-European urban elites to talk to them, and then they say that this is the face of Ukraine, or this is the face of Georgia, or whatever. And of course, there are other societal groups out there, particularly in the villages, who are not experiencing so much the benefits of Europeanization, or shall we say, have yet to be persuaded of it. And in my travels in places like Ukraine and Georgia, I'm very, very struck by that. And as I said, there is this paradox that the EU, as it were, invests with one hand and then derives benefit in the other with all this cheap labour that is coming from these countries, mainly from those rural communities.
I think wearing my EBRD hat, I would plead not guilty to that particular charge. I think we have 3 or 4 offices
No,
across,
absolutely.
across Ukraine.
Yeah.
But
No.
it is an interesting point, and not valid, not just about Ukraine, but as you say, Georgia, and imagine all 6 of these countries, that there is quite a large division between urban elites or big cities and people in the villages. Anne Lewis of BEARR Trust asks, how does Tom see the development of civil society in the regions? And will this help relations with the EU?
Depends very much where you're talking about. In Ukraine, for example, I think civil society has been enormously important since 2014. Often when we've seen the government faltering or not performing, there's the famous, actually the second time in this today I'm going to be mentioning sandwiches, the famous sandwich in which the government is caught between the Ukraine's international friends on one hand and civil society on the other. And I think it's this sandwich which has enabled Ukraine to move forward in the last 6 years. Again, I think Georgia also has a strong civil society, but unfortunately in Azerbaijan, civil society has been eviscerated. It was quite strong 10 years ago and then has been progressively shut down. Obviously, if we extend civil society to include, civil society is often used as a shorthand for kind of Western-funded NGOs, but obviously it's a broader term than that. And, I think there's some interesting work being done on conservative civil society, that there are also church groups and some often rather anti-European groups as well, which call themselves civil society. So I think the answer is in the more open countries, civil society is really a big and positive factor. I just wish that in Azerbaijan and Belarus it had more opportunities.
Now the questions are coming in thick and fast now, and I'm firing them at Tom, and he's doing very well, but still far away, please. One more on Armenia. How does Tom rate European responses to the recent power struggle between Pashinyan's regime and the judicial old guard in Armenia?
Well, that's a tricky one. I mean, I think many of you will probably have noticed Armenia's peaceful revolution of 2018, which you saw some pictures of there, which was very inspiring to watch from a distance. Unfortunately, I'd just been in Yerevan a few weeks before. My timing was bad. I'd love to have been there at the time. And that really was a surge of popular citizen power in Armenia. But we have seen some rather eccentric decisions by Prime Minister Pashinyan since then to sort of continue rather in revolutionary mode. And he has gone to war with the judiciary. And I don't think anyone disputes that the judiciary in Armenia was badly in need of reform. I think the question was his attempts to kind of uproot it and to completely change the constitutional court did smack of kind of revolutionary fervor and lack of due process. So I think the EU has kind of stayed out of the public responses to that. I know the Council of Europe, Venice Commission, has publicly commented and expressed some disquiet on that. And obviously, we wait and see what the outcome of that process is. Hopefully, it will result in even if the process was bad, it will result in a more independent judiciary. The fear is that, as happened rather in Georgia after the Rose Revolution, you end up with a judiciary which used to be accountable to the old regime and is now only accountable to its new political masters, which is obviously not what we want to see.
Moving from Armenia to its near neighbor, in fact, Azerbaijan. Magsud asks, in the case of Azerbaijani EU relations, while Azerbaijan offers natural resources to the EU, gas and oil pipelines, what does Azerbaijan want in return from the EU? Is it pure economic gain, an economic relationship? Or is there more to it? Legitimacy, for example?
Well, it depends, I guess, what you mean by Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijani government and elite, I think, is fairly explicit in that it sees a relationship based on energy supplies that indeed now through a network of pipelines, Azerbaijan is supplying gas, in particular to Greece and Italy. Something like 4% of the EU's gas is now coming from Azerbaijan, which kind of isn't big, but isn't small, shall we say. But other than that, I think the relationship is rather stuck, because obviously the EU's emphasis on values on democracy and Azerbaijan has retreated from democracy in the last 5 years, and a lot of European organizations and NGOs have been shut down there, so it's very difficult to relate. So on the elite level, there's that kind of strategic bargaining going on, but I think Azerbaijani society would welcome more EU. So again, the cards are a bit up in the air in 2020. Azerbaijan is one of the countries which, like Russia, is suffering a double blow with the pandemic and with the fall in oil prices. And maybe that will make Azerbaijan a bit more open to Europe. I certainly hope so.
So, Tom, you're obviously an expert on the 6 countries of the Eastern Partnership. Tony Wolstenholme wants to ask your expertise on post-Brexit UK, and what changes can you foresee in UK policy towards Ukraine with the creation of the new Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office? You might want to answer that, not just about Ukraine, but about the other countries. I'm sure DFID was active in
I'm sure there are a few people here who would probably answer that question better than me, but maybe some of them don't want to speak up. I mean, obviously, I view it with some foreboding. I think the massive value added that being part of the EU's funding arm, the part of the kind of the way that one could speak with 28 voices if you wanted to make a difference in a country like Ukraine, that leverage is obviously massively reduced post-Brexit. And then I also worry about the merger of DFID and the Foreign Office, which do very different things. You know, the DFID with its much more longer-term perspective and investment in community development and peace building and all sorts of things, which the Foreign Office traditionally hasn't touched. I worry that a narrower agenda, a trade-based agenda, is going to eliminate many of the great things that DFID does at the moment. Obviously, we wait and see. But as I said, there is possibly a silver lining in the sense that the UK can act if it wants to act and form a policy. It doesn't have to do it in coordination with 27 others. It isn't held back by the lowest common denominator principle. If there's a Russian angle, it doesn't have to worry about Cyprus being too pro-Russian or Portugal not caring about Russia, etc., etc. So I think possibly there could be a silver lining, but I think all of us are just very much in wait and see moment, and are hoping that that British foreign policy kind of can get back on its feet again after a very difficult 3 or 4 years.
Please keep your questions coming. If we run out of questions in the chat, maybe we'll invite people to actually speak their questions. We have what Heather Stacey calls an observation rather than a question. I'm going to turn it into a question. I don't know if everyone can see in the chat. It's quite a long observation, but a very interesting one from Belarus. She's active there with her charity Stand International. She says it's been very interesting in recent months to see how they're responding to the pandemic. The NGOs and her interlocutors very much taking things into their own hands, imposing their own lockdowns, etc., etc. They also tell me they're expecting a hot August when the country faces presidential elections. So the question that I'm going to create out of the observation is, what are the prospects for change in Belarus, do you think, Tom?
Okay, this is the one where I really do plead ignorance, because Belarus is the country that I really don't know about. I get most of my expertise on Belarus from 2 or 3 people, including a Carnegie contributor called Artyom Schreibman. So, but I have no first-hand handle on Belarus. I mean, as far as I can tell, nothing lasts forever. Lukashenko has been the ultimate balancer, hedger, and he's a very wily politician who everyone underrated in the 1990s and probably doesn't do now because he's the great survivor. But possibly he is overplaying his hand this time in that the Russians seem angry with him. He's not getting the support he had from Moscow. And maybe he was thinking that if he made some rather anti-Russian comments, he would get more support from the EU. But again, I don't think he understands that that's sufficient to get support from the EU. So I think we are going to see a hot August in Belarus. And if Lukashenko does get himself re-elected, I think there will be a political cost to it. But maybe someone who actually knows a bit Belarus better than me could volunteer to say that, including Heather herself. Maybe I'd like to hear what Heather. If we could hear from you.
Yes, Heather, would you like to take the floor and share some more observations from Belarus?
Can you hear me? I suspect
I can hear you.
You can. Oh right. I thought my microphone might not be working, but you can hear me.
Yeah, tell us about Belarus.
Good. I think it's been quite, as I said in my comment, it's been quite interesting. I mean, it's a very small organisation that I work for, and we just have partnerships with a few organisations, mostly outside Minsk in smaller towns. But certainly, there's very much a feeling of people. I think they've always felt this to some extent, but that they're really feeling abandoned at the moment by the government because they are getting information from elsewhere. They realise that the situation is much more serious in terms of the pandemic, and particularly because we work with organisations who work with people with disabilities, they're very conscious of the vulnerability of the people they work with, and so they're seeing the only way that we can take this forward is to take this into our own hands, and so they're organising, as I say, local lockdowns and also humanitarian assistance for communities. And I think that's quite interesting looking at it at the grassroots level and because they are making the connection between the work that they're doing there and the fact that the elections are coming up. And there's definitely a sort of, I don't know, I wouldn't, perhaps it would be too much to say it was a groundswell, but there is the beginnings of something, I think. I mean, that sounds a little bit incoherent, but yeah, I think the summer will be interesting to see what happens, because we still don't really know what's happening with the pandemic. I don't think that the statistics that we're currently seeing are probably very reliable. I'm not sure that there's all that much. There seems to be a lot of testing going on. The death rates seem to be improbably low, looking at it compared with other countries. So if things come together with what's happening with the pandemic and the political side of things in the next month or so, then I don't know, it might not just be what they were expecting at the beginning of the year, where they just assumed that Lukashenko would be re-elected, as he always is.
Thank you.
Anne suggests that Daryl Ann is very involved in Belarus, or is there anyone else with some Belarusian expertise who'd like to contribute their insights?
Yes, the pandemic is officially still not recognised in Belarus, which is extraordinary. I know more people in Minsk who have had COVID-19 than I do in the UK. So anecdotally, that suggests to me that it's pretty bad over there. I think the thing that strikes me, and I haven't been there this year because of the pandemic, so I'm really working on my Zoom and telephone conversations with my NGO partners over there. What strikes me now is the difference is that there has been an upswelling of anti-Lukashenko emotions, really. Following the Ukrainian uprising, or whatever you want to call it, and Crimea, Lukashenko positioned himself as the defender of Belarus against Russia. I mean, it was hot air, of course, but that's how he positioned himself, and that's how he was seen in the country. And his popularity rose even amongst what I would call the Minsk, the thinking people in Minsk. they felt themselves very protected by having Lukashenko there, and a Ukrainian situation couldn't happen. But now I see the opposite thing happening. Silent protests in Minsk. My colleagues have been ploughing their way to and from work every day, and the main avenue in Minsk, which is very, very long, has been lined with people just standing there silently. If you don't have a poster and you're not saying anything, at the moment you can't be arrested just for standing. So they're just standing there. Hmm. And this is obviously in protest against the crackdown on the opposition. And it seems to be swelling, not diminishing, despite the fact that the media are mostly state-controlled. So I'm not quite sure what is going to happen, whether it's going to be more of the same, or whether, in fact, Belarus is going to actually stand up and do something, whether the people are going to do something. But what interests me is I'm not so sure that the West is in a mood to support Belarus at all. I think the problem is that the West, including the EU and the Eastern Partnership, still actually regard Belarus as the buffer zone and won't touch it for fear of upsetting Putin. And I'd be interested to hear your comment on that.
Well, I would doubt that anyone has a fear of upsetting Putin. I certainly know the EU, happen to know the man who's now the EU ambassador in Belarus, and he's certainly very engaged, from what I can see, in trying to, give the opposition a voice in what's going on. So I would think the issue isn't about upsetting Putin. It's again about EU capacity at the moment to deal with this issue amongst many. But certainly, thanks for your comments on Belarus, and so, I think we should all be watching it a lot more closely than we have been.
One last question for your finale, Tom. You are an expert on the subject. It's a hard question, though. How could the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute be resolved?
Right. Well, thank you for the question. I would be the first to be cheering and opening a champagne if I could see a prospect of the resolution of the Nagorno-Karabakh dispute, which goes back to 1988, and which I've been following since the early 90s. Possibly, you may have followed it. You may have got in there a little earlier than me, Marcus, but I've certainly probably been following it longer. And unfortunately, I see no prospect of its resolution in the near future. I think it'll take another generation. It's two countries have basically invested their own kind of national self-image, their national story in this dispute, in claiming Karabakh as their own. Neither of them wants to back down. Neither of them see any room for compromise. It's kind of built into the national DNA of both countries, that Armenia is kind of not just Armenia, but it's anti-Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan isn't just Azerbaijan, but it's anti-Armenia. What could change that? Well, either a big geopolitical shift, which I don't see coming at the moment, an outbreak of democracy in Azerbaijan, but that wouldn't necessarily solve it either, or pressure from below, with both societies suddenly decided they were fed up with this and they would rather reach out to the other. But again, very little prospect of that at the moment. So I think we're not talking about resolving that dispute. We're talking about stabilizing it and kind of doing things at the margins to make it a bit more tolerable. But no good news there, I'm afraid.
Okay, a pessimistic note to end on, but it's not all bad news, as I think Tom has made clear. Thank you so much, Tom, for enlightening us on this crucial partnership and crucial relationship between these 6 countries and the European Union and other players. Thank you so much. I'd also like to thank the BEARR Trust for making it happen today.
Support the BEARR Trust.
Well, indeed, you can express your thanks by going to bear.org, which is the BEARR Trust website. You can find out all about the BEARR Trust there. You can donate, you can volunteer your time and your knowledge. And I'd personally like to thank BEARR Trust for inviting me to front this today, and hand over now to Nicola.
Okay, Marcus, thank you very much. I just wanted to finish very briefly by adding my thanks to Tom for that absolutely fascinating talk, and Marcus for your very skillful handling of all the questions. And thank you everyone for those cracking good questions as well. Thank you for joining us today. Do please stay in touch. If you don't receive our newsletters, do sign up for them. They come out every 2 months, not too many. Your inbox won't get too cluttered. And I hope that I will perhaps see you at a BEARR event in the future. So meanwhile, a final thanks to Sophie van Dijk for her excellent control of all the technology. And it just remains to me to say, have a very good evening, everybody. Thank you and goodbye.
Okay. Thank you.